The mystery of closed, time-like curves, time travel's dark implications. In the mathematics of general relativity, in the equations that Einstein developed to describe how space-time curves and warps around mass and energy, there exist certain solutions that shouldn't be possible, that violate our intuitive understanding of causality and temporal progression, but that are nonetheless mathematically valid, perfectly consistent with the laws of physics as we understand them. These solutions are called closed time-like curves, or CTCS, paths through spacetime that loop back on themselves, world lines that return to their starting point, not just in space, but in time, trajectories that, if followed, would bring a traveler back to the moment they departed, allowing them to encounter their past self, to potentially change events that from their perspective have already occurred, to create the grandfather paradoxes and bootstrap paradoxes that science fiction has explored for decades, but that physics suggests might actually be possible under certain extreme conditions. The Gödel metric, the Tipler cylinder, the rotating black hole solutions. Multiple frameworks in general relativity permit CTCs, allow for space-time configurations where time travel to the past becomes geometrically possible, where the future can causally influence the past, where the arrow of time becomes circular rather than linear. And this creates profound implications that go far beyond the romantic notion of visiting history or correcting mistakes, implications that suggest the universe might already contain time travelers, that causality as we understand it might be an illusion or approximation that breaks down under certain conditions, that free will and determinism achieve strange synthesis, where futures that already happened can still be changed, where the past isn't fixed but remains fluid and accessible, where the entire structure of temporal experience that we take for granted, the sense that past is immutable and future is open, might be fundamentally wrong, might be limited perception that fails to capture how time actually functions at the deepest level of physical law, leaving us to wonder whether CTCs remain purely mathematical curiosities that physical constraints prevent from existing in reality, or whether they might actually occur in extreme astrophysical conditions, or might be engineerable by sufficiently advanced civilizations. And if they exist or can be created, what dark implications follow from the possibility of causal loops, of events that cause themselves, of information or matter traveling backward through time to alter the conditions that produced them, creating logical paradoxes that either must be resolved through exotic physics, like the many worlds interpretation, or that might prove that time travel, despite being mathematically permitted, is physically impossible for reasons we don't yet understand, leaving closed time-like curves as the most disturbing prediction of general relativity. The feature of space-time geometry that suggests everything we believe about cause and effect and temporal progression might be parochial and incomplete, valid only in the limited regions of space-time we've experienced, breaking down in circumstances we haven't encountered, but that physics says should be possible. Waiting perhaps in the cores of rotating black holes, or in the wakes of infinitely long rotating cylinders, or in space-time configurations that advanced technology might create, waiting to demonstrate that time is not what we think it is, that the past remains accessible, that causality forms loops rather than chains, and that the implications of these facts are darker and stranger than science fiction has adequately explored, because fictional time travel assumes narrative coherence and resolution, assumes that paradoxes will be avoided or resolved through clever plotting, while actual closed time-like curves, as described by physics, suggest that reality might simply be paradoxical, might contain causal structures that violate logic, might permit situations where effects precede causes, and where the entire notion of temporal ordering becomes meaningless or ambiguous, leaving us uncertain whether we should hope that CTCs remain impossible despite mathematical permission, or whether their existence would reveal truths about reality's structure that are currently hidden from us by the limitations of our experience and our conception of how time must work. The mathematical foundation is solid. Kurt Gödel, Einstein's colleague at the Institute for Advanced Study, discovered in 1949 that the equations of general relativity permit a universe that rotates, and that in such a universe, closed time-like curves would exist, paths that loop back to their temporal starting point. Einstein was disturbed by this solution because it suggested his theory might allow violations of causality. Though Gödel argued that the solution simply revealed something true about time that our intuitions had missed, that the possibility of returning to the past demonstrated that time isn't fundamentally different from space, that the flow of time we experience is subjective rather than objective, that the universe itself is a four-dimensional block where past, present, and future coexist eternally, and the distinction between them is merely perspectival. The Gödel universe doesn't match observations. Our universe doesn't appear to rotate in the way his solution requires. But the existence of the solution proves that general relativity permits CTCs under at least some conditions, establishing that time travel to the past isn't forbidden by the fundamental laws of physics, even if the specific conditions required don't obtain in our actual universe. This opened the question of whether other solutions, perhaps more physically realistic, might also permit CTCs. The Tipler cylinder is another CTC solution. Proposed by physicist Frank Tipler in 1974, it involves an infinitely long cylinder of dense matter radiating at speeds approaching light speed. Space-time around such an object would be dragged into rotation by frame-dragging effects, and sufficiently close to the cylinder, this space-time rotation would become so extreme that closed time-like curves would form, allowing travelers who follow the appropriate paths around the cylinder to return to their temporal starting point. The practical problems are insurmountable: infinite length, enormous density, relativistic rotation speeds. But the solution proves that CTCs aren't limited to exotic universe-scale configurations, like Gödel's rotating cosmos, that they could in principle exist around specific objects if those objects have the right properties. Rotating black holes, described by the Kerr metric, also contain CTCs in their interior regions. The singularity inside a rotating black hole isn't a point, but a ring, and the space-time geometry in the region inside this ring, singularity permits closed time-like curves. Travelers who somehow survived crossing the event horizon and the inner Cauchy horizon could in principle navigate these CTCs, traveling backward in time. Of course, the tidal forces and radiation would destroy any physical traveler, and the Cauchy horizon is likely unstable in ways that prevent CTCs from actually being traversable. But the mathematical solution exists, demonstrating that CTCs aren't just exotic theoretical possibilities, but might exist inside astronomical objects that actually occur in nature, though in regions that are effectively inaccessible and almost certainly lethal. The wormhole scenarios that Carl Sagan popularized and that Kip Thorne analyzed rigorously can also create CTCs under certain conditions. If you create a wormhole connecting two regions of space, then accelerate one mouth of the wormhole to near light speed while leaving the other stationary, time dilation effects will cause the two mouths to experience time at different rates. Eventually, the traveling mouth will be in the past relative to the stationary mouth, and traversing the wormhole would allow time travel to the past. The practical and theoretical problems are enormous. Wormholes require exotic matter with negative energy density to remain stable, and any attempt to create a CTC through wormhole manipulation might be prevented by quantum effects that destroy the wormhole, or by still unknown physical principles that forbid time machines, even when the mathematics allows them. But the possibility exists within known physics, demonstrating that time travel might be achievable through engineering, rather than requiring discovery of natural CTCs. The paradoxes are where the dark implications emerge. The grandfather paradox is most famous. You travel back in time and kill your grandfather before he had children, preventing your own birth, which means you never existed to travel back in time, which means your grandfather lived and had children, which means you were born and traveled back to kill him, creating an infinite logical loop with no consistent resolution. The bootstrap paradox is equally troubling. Information or objects that have no origin, that exist only because they were brought back from the future to the past, where they were eventually brought forward to the future. A book containing advanced physics brought back in time and given to a young scientist who studies it, makes the discoveries it contains, and eventually writes the very book that will be brought back to him. But where did the information in the book originally come from? It exists in a causal loop with no external source, no creative origin, information that has always existed in the loop, but that was never actually created by anyone. The possible resolutions to these paradoxes reveal the dark implications. The Novikov self-consistency principle proposes that time travel is only possible if the actions of travelers don't create paradoxes, that the universe somehow enforces consistency, preventing any action that would alter the past in ways that contradict what already happened. In this framework, free will for time travelers becomes limited or illusory. You can travel to the past, but you can't change it, because any action you attempt will turn out to have already been part of the history you remember, will be prevented or will fail, or will have unexpected consequences that preserve consistency. Your attempts to kill your grandfather will fail. The gun will jam, or you'll miss, or you'll kill the wrong person, or you'll discover the man you thought was your grandfather wasn't actually your biological ancestor. The universe conspires to maintain consistency, making the past effectively immutable, even when you're physically present in it. This resolution is dark because it implies predetermination, cosmic censorship of possibilities, a universe where certain actions are simply impossible, not because of lack of power or capability, but because they would violate causal consistency. It suggests that physics contains built-in constraints on action that operate at a level beyond human comprehension, that free will is limited by temporal consistency requirements that prevent paradox. You can travel in time, but you can't actually change anything, making the entire enterprise futile, making you a prisoner of consistency, even as you move through the timeline. The many worlds interpretation provides a different resolution. When you travel back and kill your grandfather, the universe splits. The timeline you came from continues to exist with you having been born and having traveled back. But your action creates a new branch, a parallel timeline where your grandfather dies and you're never born in that branch. The paradox is avoided because there are now two separate realities, and causal consistency is maintained within each, even though they're incompatible with each other. But this resolution is dark in different ways. It means you can never return to your origin timeline. That backward time travel is actually travel to parallel worlds, that you're irreversibly separated from everything you knew, exiled to a timeline where you might not exist, and where your actions have consequences you can't escape by returning home, because your home timeline is now permanently inaccessible. Exists in superposition state that you've decohered from through your time travel action. Another possibility is that quantum effects prevent CTCs from being traversable, even when they exist mathematically. Hawking proposed the chronology protection conjecture, suggesting that quantum mechanics contains principles that prevent time machines from being created, that whenever space-time configuration approaches creating a CTC, Quantum vacuum fluctuations or other quantum processes generate diverging effects that prevent the CTC from forming or make it untraversable. The universe protects causality through quantum mechanisms we don't fully understand, ensuring that while CTCs might exist mathematically and might even form temporarily, they can never actually be used for time travel, preserving temporal ordering at the fundamental level. This is dark because it means the mathematics of general relativity permits time travel, but reality forbids it through additional constraints that we haven't discovered yet. That our understanding of physics is incomplete in ways that specifically relate to causality and temporal structure. That there are deep principles governing time that we're missing. That the universe has built-in protection against paradox that operates through mechanisms we don't comprehend. It means causality is more fundamental than space-time geometry. That there are laws beyond Einstein's equations that prevent the most disturbing implications of general relativity from being realized. If CTCs do exist and are traversable, if time travel to the past is physically possible, the implications extend beyond paradoxes to questions about the nature of time itself. The block universe interpretation suggests that past, present, and future all exist simultaneously in the four-dimensional space-time manifold, that the flow of time is illusion created by consciousness, experiencing space-time sequentially, rather than all at once. CTCS support this interpretation because they suggest time is just another dimension like space, that traveling through time is geometrically equivalent to traveling through space, that the distinction we make between past and future is anthropocentric rather than fundamental to physics. But this means everything that will ever happen has in some sense already happened, that the future exists just as concretely as the past, that free will is either illusory or operates in ways we don't understand, that the open future we believe we're creating through our choices already exists as determined fact in the block universe, making choice and agency mysterious or impossible. If the future exists and can be visited via CTCs, then it's fixed, then everything is predetermined, then the sense of possibilities and potential is false, is just ignorance of what's already actualized in the complete four-dimensional structure of space-time. The question of whether we're already living in a universe that contains time travelers from the future is disturbing to contemplate. If CTCs are possible, if advanced civilizations or future humans have access to time travel technology, they might be present in our current time, observing or influencing events, creating the very history we're experiencing. Every mysterious event, every unexplained phenomenon, every moment where causality seems ambiguous or where coincidences seem too perfect might involve time travelers ensuring certain outcomes, preventing certain disasters, guiding history along paths that lead to the futures they come from. The absence of obvious time travelers might mean time travel is impossible, or might mean travelers are careful to avoid detection, or might mean we can't recognize them because they appear as ordinary people, or might mean the Novikov principle prevents actions that would make time travel obvious because such actions would create paradoxes. The lack of evidence for time travelers could be evidence that chronology protection works, or could be evidence that time travelers are successfully hiding, or could be evidence that we don't know what to look for, that time travelers don't match our expectations of what they'd be like. If you could travel backward in time, the ethical implications are staggering. Do you have obligation to prevent atrocities you know will occur? Do you have right to change history for what you believe is the better, imposing your values on alternate timeline? If you prevent a disaster, what unintended consequences ripple forward from that change? The people who would have been born in the original timeline won't exist in the altered one. People who wouldn't have existed in the original timeline will exist in the changed version. Are you committing genocide and creation simultaneously? The moral weight of changing history, of having that power, of deciding which version of events should be real is beyond anything human ethics has developed frameworks for addressing. The possibility that CTCs exist naturally or could be engineered by advanced civilizations suggests that causality as we experience it might be local and approximate, valid only in the limited regions of space-time we inhabit, breaking down in extreme conditions where the full implications of general relativity manifest. We live our lives assuming the past is fixed and the future is open, assuming causes precede effects, assuming time flows forward uniformly. But physics suggests these assumptions might be wrong, might be convenient fictions that work only because we're far from CTCS, because we exist in regions of space-time where temporal ordering is clear and paradoxes don't arise. What happens if we encounter a region where time loops, where effects precede causes, where the comfortable assumptions break down? What happens to consciousness if it experiences nonlinear time, if it traverses a CTC and encounters its own past? Does identity remain coherent across causal loops? Can consciousness process experiencing events in order different from their causal sequence? The psychological implications of time travel might be as profound as the physical implications, might reveal that human consciousness is fundamentally adapted to linear time and can't function properly when that linearity is violated. Closed time-like curves represent the point where general relativity produces results so counterintuitive and so disturbing that even physicists who work with the mathematics regularly have divided opinions about what they mean. Some believe CTCs prove that time travel is possible, and we simply haven't discovered how to engineer it yet. Others believe CTCs prove that general relativity is incomplete, that a complete theory of quantum gravity will eliminate CTC solutions and restore causal sanity. Others believe CTCS are possible, but quantum chronology protection makes them untraversable. Others embrace the implications, accept that time might really be circular in some circumstances, that causality might really be looser than we thought, that the universe might really permit logical paradoxes and information that has no origin. The mathematics is clear. The implications are dark. The reality remains uncertain. Whether closed time-like curves exist only on paper, or whether they exist in physical reality, whether they could be engineered or discovered, whether they permit actual time travel, or whether quantum effects prevent their traversal, whether paradoxes are avoided through many worlds splitting, or through Novikov consistency, or through mechanisms we haven't discovered. These questions remain among the most profound in theoretical physics, among the most disturbing in their implications for causality and consciousness and free will and the nature of time itself, leaving us uncertain whether to hope that time travel remains impossible despite mathematical permission, or whether its possibility would reveal truths about reality's structure that would be worth the price of losing the comfortable fiction that time flows forward linearly, that the past is fixed and the future is open, that causality operates in the straightforward way our intuition suggests, when closed time-like curves whisper that maybe time is stranger than that, maybe causality loops, maybe the future influences the past, maybe everything we think we know about temporal ordering is wrong, is local approximation, is convenient lie that works only because we're trapped in regions of space-time where time appears to flow linearly, where CTCs don't exist or can't be accessed, leaving us with equations that permit time travel and with universe that might or might not allow what the equations describe, with dark implications that follow from the possibility that we could travel backward, could encounter our past selves, could create paradoxes that either can't be resolved or that resolve in ways that violate everything we believe about choice and causality and the forward flow of time that we've assumed was fundamental. But that general relativity suggests is merely typical. merely the pattern we experience in our corner of space-time. Maybe breaking down elsewhere, maybe breaking down in conditions we could create if we understood enough. Maybe already breaking down in astronomical objects we can't directly observe, in the interiors of rotating black holes where CTCs might actually exist, where time loops back on itself, where cause and effect become circular, where the dark implications of closed time-like curves stop being theoretical and become actual features of reality. Features that, if we ever access them or encounter them, would force us to confront that time is not what we thought, that causality is not what we assumed, that the universe permits loops and paradoxes and time travel and all the disturbing implications that follow, leaving us hoping perhaps that chronology protection works, that quantum effects prevent CTCs from being traversable, that the universe protects itself from paradox, that time travel remains impossible despite being mathematically permitted. Because the alternative, that we could actually travel backward, actually change the past, actually create the paradoxes that break logic and causality, is darker than most science fiction has explored, is implication of general relativity that even physicists who work with the mathematics every day sometimes wish wasn't there, wish could be eliminated by additional physics we haven't discovered yet, wish would turn out to be mathematical artifact rather than physical possibility. But that remains in the equations, remains as prediction of our best theory of space-time and gravity, remains as the dark secret at the heart of general relativity, the disturbing implication that time might not be what we think it is, that closed time-like curves might actually exist, and that if they do, everything we believe about causality and temporal progression and the impossibility of changing the past might be wrong, might be limited perspective, might be comfortable illusion that shatters when confronted with the full implications of physics, with the loops and paradoxes and time travel that general relativity permits, that mathematics describes, that reality might actually contain, waiting perhaps in extreme conditions we haven't encountered, waiting perhaps to be discovered or engineered, waiting to prove that time is circular, that causality loops, that the dark implications of closed time-like curves are not just abstract mathematical curiosities, but actual features of the universe we inhabit, features we simply haven't accessed yet because we lack the technology or because we exist far from the extreme conditions where space-time's curvature permits the impossible, permits the past to be reached from the future, permits time travel and all its paradoxes and all its dark implications for everything we think we know about. How reality works and how time flows, and whether the past can be changed, and whether the future already exists, and whether free will is possible if causality forms loops instead of chains, leaving closed time-like curves as the most disturbing feature of our best physics. The prediction we hope is wrong, but that mathematics says is right. The dark implication that won't go away no matter how much we wish it would, that remains embedded in general relativity, that remains possible, that remains waiting. The Pascagoula, abduction, floating beings with no faces. On the evening of October 11th, 1973, two shipyard workers, Charles Hickson, age 42, and Calvin Parker, age 19, were fishing on the west bank of the Pascagoula River in Mississippi when they claimed to have been taken aboard a craft by entities that defied every expectation of what alien beings should look like. Creatures so bizarre and so unlike the typical gray aliens that would come to dominate abduction narratives that their very strangeness lends credibility. Suggests that if this was fabrication, the witnesses chose descriptions that were remarkably unconventional and difficult to hoax. The beings were described as roughly 5 feet tall, with wrinkled gray skin that looked robotic or mechanical, with no discernible eyes. no mouths, no recognizable facial features at all. Just smooth or featureless areas where faces should be. They had crab-like or mitten-like appendages instead of hands. And most disturbingly, they didn't walk but floated or glided above the ground, moving without apparent locomotion, defying gravity in ways that added to the profound wrongness of their appearance and behavior. 3 of these entities allegedly emerged from an oval-shaped craft that produced a buzzing sound, approached the terrified men through floating rather than walking, and despite having no visible means of communication, somehow paralyzed both witnesses, lifted them through floating or levitation into the craft, subjected them to examination that Hickson described as mechanical and invasive, while Parker claimed to have fainted from fear and remembered little, and then returned them to the riverbank. Approximately 20 minutes after the encounter began, leaving them traumatized, disoriented, and with a story so strange that when they reported it to local sheriff's department, investigators were initially skeptical, but became convinced through various means that the witnesses genuinely believed their account, that they were exhibiting real trauma rather than performing deception, making the Pascagoula abduction one of the most compelling and best documented early abduction cases, distinguished by the witnesses' consistency, by their genuine distress, by the unusual nature of the entities described, and by the fact that both men maintained their stories until death. Hickson until his death in 2011, and Parker, who despite decades of trauma and reluctance to discuss the encounter, eventually came forward again to reaffirm that what happened was real, that he was taken aboard a craft by beings that had no faces, that floated rather than walked, that examined him through means he couldn't understand or adequately describe, leaving both men forever changed by 20 minutes of missing time and encounter with entities so strange that they don't fit easily into established UFO narratives, that represent something genuinely other if the account is accurate, something that wasn't human but also wasn't the familiar gray aliens of later abduction accounts, something that seemed mechanical or robotic, but that moved with purpose and intention, something that appeared to be conducting examination or research, but that communicated nothing, that had no faces to read emotion from, that gave no indication of why they were there or what they wanted, except that they took 2 men fishing on a river and returned them 20 minutes later with memories of levitating aboard a craft and being examined by faceless floating beings that violated every expectation of how entities should appear or behave, making the Pascagoula abduction either genuine encounter with non-human intelligence of type we haven't encountered before or since, or elaborate hoax sustained by 2 men for decades despite offering them more trauma and difficulty than benefit, despite Parker in particular suffering such severe psychological effects that he avoided discussing the incident for decades and only reluctantly acknowledged it later in life, suggesting that whether the beings were real or hallucination or something else, the experience was genuine and was traumatic, was something that happened to these men in their perception, even if it didn't happen in shared objective reality, leaving the Pascagoula abduction as one of UFO history's most fascinating and disturbing cases. One of the few where the entities described don't fit templates, don't match expectations, don't conform to the cultural narratives about what aliens should look like, making them either more credible because they're not borrowed from science fiction, or more suspicious because they're so strange that they seem designed to be unbelievable, depending on whether you interpret unconventional details as evidence of authenticity or evidence of creative fabrication, leaving the case as it has been for over 50 years. Compelling, disturbing, well-documented, and ultimately unresolved. The immediate aftermath of the incident is well documented because the witnesses went directly to sheriff's department, arriving clearly distressed, Hickson calm but shaken, and Parker so terrified he was nearly incoherent, requiring medical attention for what appeared to be psychological shock. The sheriff, initially skeptical, used standard investigative technique of leaving the witnesses alone in a room with a hidden recording device, expecting them to discuss their fabricated story or break character when they believed they weren't being monitored. The recording instead captured genuine distress, Parker sobbing and asking Hickson if the experience had really happened, Hickson reassuring him in tones suggesting genuine belief rather than conspiratorial coordination, creating audio record that convinced investigators the witnesses weren't consciously perpetrating hoax, that they genuinely believed something had happened to them, even if what happened remained unclear. Both men were subjected to polygraph examinations. Hickson passed unequivocally. The examiner concluded he was telling the truth as he believed it. Parker was too distressed to complete examination initially, but later took polygraphs that also indicated truthfulness. Polygraphs aren't infallible. They measure physiological stress responses that correlate with deception, but that can be affected by various factors. But they do indicate that the witnesses weren't consciously lying, weren't experiencing the physiological patterns associated with intentional fabrication, suggesting that whatever happened, the witnesses genuinely believed their account. The physical evidence was minimal. No unusual radiation, no soil samples showing anomalies, no physical traces at the site beyond the normal riverbank environment. The craft allegedly landed or hovered near the bank, but left no impressions or burns. The witnesses had no unusual marks on their bodies beyond Hickson's report of soreness consistent with the invasive examination he described. The absence of physical evidence doesn't disprove the account, but does mean verification relies entirely on witness testimony and behavior, rather than on objective material traces that could be analyzed independently. The description of the entities is the most distinctive element. 5 feet tall, gray, wrinkled skin with texture described as robotic or elephant-like. No visible eyes or facial features beyond slight indentations or protrusions that might have served sensory functions. Crab-like or mitten-like appendages that ended in pincer-like or stumped formations, rather than fingers. Most bizarrely, they floated or glided several inches above ground, moving horizontally without leg movement, without visible propulsion, as if suspended by forces that weren't apparent to the witnesses. This floating locomotion added to the profound wrongness of the encounter, made the beings seem even more alien than their appearance alone would suggest. The lack of faces is particularly disturbing because humans are hardwired to recognize faces, to find faces in ambiguous patterns, to derive social and emotional information from facial features. Beings with no faces violate this fundamental human perceptual system, create entities that can't be read, that provide no feedback, that offer no indication of intention or emotion through the facial cues that humans rely on for social interaction. Whether this was actual characteristic of the entities, or whether it was how witnesses' brains processed beings whose faces were so alien that human face recognition systems couldn't parse them into comprehensible features is ambiguous, but the effect was traumatizing. Being examined by beings you can't read, whose intentions are completely opaque, whose very appearance suggests they're not biological in ways you understand. The mechanical quality described by witnesses is intriguing. The beings moved in coordinated mechanical ways, floated with precision, conducted the examination with what seemed like programmed efficiency, rather than curiosity or scientific interest. This has led to speculation that the entities were robots or biological machines, that what Hickson and Parker encountered weren't living beings, but rather automated systems sent to conduct examinations, which might explain the lack of faces. They didn't need faces because they weren't conscious entities requiring expression or communication, but rather were programmed collectors executing pre-programmed examination protocols. But if they were robotic, who or what built them? The craft they emerged from was described as oval or fish-shaped, producing buzzing or zipping sounds, appearing solid and metallic. If the faceless beings were drones, the intelligence that created and deployed them remained hidden during the encounter, directing the examination from elsewhere, either from within the craft's interior that the witnesses didn't see, or from remote location, or through automated systems that required no active direction. This interpretation makes the encounter less about meeting alien intelligence directly, and more about being processed by their automated systems, being examined by machines, while the actual intelligence remains inaccessible and unknowable. The paralysis both men experienced is consistent with other abduction accounts. They described being unable to move, being lifted or floated into the craft against their will, but without physical force, rather through some mechanism that controlled their bodies, or that suspended them in fields that prevented movement. Hickson remained conscious throughout and remembered the examination involving a large, eye-like device that moved over his body, scanning or analyzing him. Parker claims to have fainted from terror early in the experience and remembered little beyond the initial approach of the beings, suggesting that different individuals respond differently to the paralysis or to whatever consciousness-affecting systems the entities or craft employed. The 20-minute duration is notable because it's brief compared to many abduction accounts that involve hours of missing time. The witnesses were returned quickly, suggesting either that the examination was efficient and required minimal time, or that time passed differently for the witnesses than for external observers, or that the beings had specific limited objectives that didn't require extended captivity. The brevity might also make the account more credible. It's not elaborated into hours of complex procedures and interactions that would provide more opportunity for confabulation or inconsistency. The location is less remote than many abduction sites. The west bank of the Pascagoula River near a shipyard isn't isolated wilderness. It's near industrial development and population centers. Choosing such a location seems risky if avoiding detection was priority, unless the beings didn't care about being observed, or unless they had capabilities that made detection by others unlikely even in relatively populated areas. No other witnesses have come forward claiming to have seen the craft or the incident, despite it allegedly occurring near dusk, when some people would have been active in the area, though absence of corroborating witnesses doesn't prove the event didn't occur, just that if it did occur, it was somehow limited to the immediate vicinity of the two men. The aftermath for both men was severe. Parker, in particular, suffered psychological trauma that affected his life for decades, developed anxiety and stress-related health problems, avoided public attention and discussion of the incident, despite it being a defining event of his life. This doesn't seem consistent with hoaxer behavior. People who fabricate sensational stories typically seek attention and benefit from their notoriety, whereas Parker fled from attention and suffered significantly from being associated with the incident. Hickson handled the attention better, but also maintained consistency in his account across decades, participating in UFO conferences and interviews, but never embellishing significantly beyond his original report, never adding dramatic elaborations that would make the story more compelling or marketable. The cultural impact was significant. The Pascagoula abduction became one of the first widely publicized abduction cases, predating the Betty and Barney Hill cases, full cultural absorption, and occurring years before the gray alien archetype became dominant in abduction narratives. The uniqueness of the Pascagoula entities, faceless, floating, robotic, means they didn't become templates for subsequent reports, suggesting they weren't created from existing cultural expectations about alien appearance, and weren't subsequently copied by hoaxers or confabulators who would have been more likely to describe grays if they were borrowing from abduction narratives, The skeptical explanations focus on several possibilities. Misidentified mundane phenomenon, perhaps military testing of equipment that created lights and sounds that frightened the witnesses, combined with sleep deprivation, or psychological states that created hallucinatory experience of entities and abduction. This struggles with the specificity of the description and the sustained trauma both men exhibited, which seems excessive for misidentifying conventional phenomenon, even combined with hallucination. Hoax is possible, but seems unlikely given the lack of benefit to the witnesses. The sustained consistency across decades, Parker's evident suffering and reluctance to profit from the incident, and the audio recording from the sheriff's department that captured apparently genuine distress when the witnesses believed they weren't being monitored. If hoax, it was remarkably committed and remarkably unrewarding for those perpetrating it. Psychological explanation involving shared delusion, or folie à deux, where one witness's belief contaminated the other, is theoretically possible, but doesn't easily account for the immediate onset. They went from normal fishing to shared complex, detailed hallucination of abduction without apparent trigger or precedent, and both maintained the delusion with remarkable consistency despite it causing significant life difficulties. Sleep paralysis with hypnagogic hallucinations seems unlikely, given that both men were allegedly conscious and active, fishing on a riverbank when the encounter began, not in the transitional sleep states where paralysis typically occurs. The extraterrestrial hypothesis remains most straightforward interpretation if the account is accurate. Non-human intelligent entities in a craft took 2 humans for brief examination and returned them, with the entities having appearance and capabilities that don't match human biology or technology. The faceless floating beings would be actual aliens conducting research or surveillance, with appearance and behavior that's strange to us, but that's normal for them, and with technology allowing paralysis, levitation, and examination through means we don't possess or understand. The interdimensional hypothesis proposes the entities came from adjacent dimension rather than from distant planet, that the craft wasn't spaceship but dimensional portal or vehicle, that the beings appeared faceless and mechanical because they're not fully manifesting in our dimensional space, that we're seeing partial projection of entities that exist primarily elsewhere. This explains the strangeness of their appearance and behavior through dimensional mismatch rather than through alien biology. Whether the Pascagoula abduction represents genuine encounter with non-human intelligence, represents psychological or perceptual phenomenon affecting both witnesses simultaneously, represents misidentification and confabulation, or represents something else that current frameworks don't adequately describe. The case remains compelling because the witnesses were consistent, were genuinely affected, and described entities that don't fit established patterns, that seem too strange to be borrowed from existing narratives, and too specific to be easily dismissed as generic hallucination. The faceless beings that floated rather than walked, that had no eyes but somehow sensed their environment, that examined humans through means that seemed mechanical and impersonal, that took 20 minutes out of 2 men's lives and left them forever changed, remain one of UFO history's most distinctive and disturbing reported encounters. One of the few cases where the witnesses maintained their accounts until death despite considerable personal cost. One of the few where the entities described are so unusual that they challenge both believers and skeptics to explain how 2 men fishing on a river could generate or encounter such a specific strangeness, leaving the Pascagoula abduction as it has always been: strange, compelling, disturbing, unresolved, and dominated by the image of beings with no faces floating through the darkness, conducting their examination and then returning their subjects to the riverbank. As if 20 minutes of missing time and encounter with the profoundly alien was just another Thursday evening in Mississippi, just another unexplained incident in the long history of humans reporting contact with entities that don't fit our understanding of what should be possible, what should exist, what should be floating through the darkness, taking people aboard craft to examine them through means we don't understand for purposes we can only speculate about. The faceless beings that Hickson and Parker encountered, that they reported, that they never recanted, that they took to their graves as defining traumatic experience that was either real encounter with non-human intelligence, or was hallucination so powerful and so specific that it functioned as encounter, that created trauma equivalent to actual abduction, whether or not actual abduction occurred, leaving the Pascagoula case as permanent testimony to something: genuine alien contact, psychological phenomenon, shared delusion, misidentification, or mystery that transcends these categories, that happened to two men fishing on a river, that involved beings with no faces that floated rather than walked, that changed both men forever, and that remains, after 5 decades, one of the most compelling and least explained abduction accounts in the history of UFO phenomena. A case that refuses easy dismissal, that challenges simple explanations, that suggests that if abductions are real, the entities involved are far stranger than the gray aliens of popular culture, far more disturbing in their featureless faces and their floating locomotion and their mechanical indifference. The beings that took Hickson and Parker examined them and returned them, leaving us with their story, with their consistency, with their trauma, and with the question of what actually happened on October 11th, 1973, on the west bank of the Pascagoula River, when two men fishing encountered something that had no faces, that floated through the darkness, that took them aboard a craft and changed them forever, leaving the case unsolved, unexplained, and permanently disturbing in its specificity, in its strangeness, in its suggestion that the universe contains beings so unlike us that they violate every expectation, that they float without walking, that they examine without faces, that they exist in ways we can barely comprehend, and that encountering them is experience that marks you permanently, that trauma that persists across decades, that memory that can't be dismissed or explained away, no matter how much you wish it could be. The faceless beings that float in the darkness, that the Pascagoula witnesses encountered, that might be there still, examining, collecting, conducting their incomprehensible research on humans they select for reasons we don't understand, returning them traumatized and changed, leaving cases like Pascagoula as permanent questions in the historical record, as permanent mysteries that suggest reality is stranger than we acknowledge, that the universe contains beings that float and have no faces, and that take people and return them, leaving only the testimony, only the trauma, only the question of what they were, what they wanted, and whether they'll return. The Paul Amadeus Dienach Chronicles, a man who woke up in the future. In 1921, a Swiss-Austrian teacher named Paul Amadeus Dienach fell into a year-long coma after complications from tuberculosis. When he woke in 1922, he appeared physically recovered, but psychologically transformed in ways his doctors couldn't explain. He began writing obsessively, filling notebook after notebook with detailed accounts of what he claimed to have experienced during his unconscious year, except he hadn't experienced nothing or darkness or the blank void that coma patients typically report. According to Dienach, his consciousness had left his body in 1921 and woken up in the body of another man, living in the year 3096 AD, over 1,000 years in the future. For that entire year, while his physical body lay comatose in a hospital bed in Geneva, his awareness had been living a future life, experiencing a world that humanity wouldn't reach for another millennium, learning about technologies and social structures and historical events that hadn't happened yet, but that he now remembered as if he'd lived through them. When his consciousness returned to his own time and his own body, he was left with complete memories of that future year, knowledge of what would happen to humanity over the next 1,000 years, and the burden of information he couldn't prove, and that most people would dismiss as elaborate delusion or fever dream, rather than genuine temporal displacement of consciousness into a future reality. Dienach knew he was dying. The tuberculosis that had caused his coma would kill him within a few years, and he had no time to waste trying to convince skeptics that his experience was real. Instead, he focused on documenting everything he'd learned, writing detailed journals about the future he'd witnessed, describing it in terms his 20th century perspective could understand, while struggling with concepts and technology so advanced that he lacked the vocabulary to properly articulate what he'd seen. The journals described a world utterly transformed from his own time. No more nations in the way he understood them. No wars or conflicts of the type that had recently torn Europe apart in World War I. A global civilization that had transcended many of the problems that plagued humanity in Dienach's era. But the path to that future was anything but peaceful, and the knowledge he brought back included warnings about catastrophes and transformations that humanity would have to survive before reaching the enlightened state he'd witnessed. Before his death in 1924, Dienach entrusted his journals to his student in Greece, George Papachazis, asking him to translate them from German to Greek and to share the knowledge with those who might understand its significance. Papachazis initially thought the journals were a novel, an elaborate science fiction work his teacher had been writing. Only after Dienach's death did Papachazis discover the claim that the contents were actual memories from the future rather than fiction. He spent decades studying the journals, eventually publishing them in Greece in 1972, under the title Valley of the Roses, where they became underground classics in Greek metaphysical circles, while remaining almost unknown in the broader world. The text described in extraordinary detail a future history spanning from Dienach's time to the year 3096, covering wars and technological revolutions and social transformations that would reshape humanity completely, culminating in a society that had achieved what Dienach could only describe as a higher state of consciousness, where humans had evolved beyond their current limitations into something greater. The future Dienach described began with darkness before reaching enlightenment. The 20th century would be catastrophic. He foresaw another world war even more devastating than the first, conflicts that would threaten human survival, technologies emerging that could destroy civilization. The 20th and 21st centuries were periods of crisis, where humanity teetered on the edge of extinction through nuclear weapons, environmental collapse, and social breakdown. But somehow, civilization survived these trials, and in the centuries following, humanity began to transform. The nation-state system collapsed, replaced by global governance that actually worked because it emerged organically from necessity, rather than being imposed by conquest. Technology advanced to points where material scarcity became obsolete, where energy was abundant and clean, where disease and aging were controllable, if not entirely eliminated. But the most significant transformation wasn't technological. It was consciousness itself. Dienach described that somewhere around the year 2400, humanity underwent what the people of the future called the Great Realization, a species-wide shift in awareness where large numbers of people began to experience consciousness differently, to perceive reality in ways that transcended normal sensory experience, to access information and states of being that previous generations would have considered supernatural or impossible. This wasn't religious rapture or mystical ascension, but rather an evolutionary development, the next stage in human consciousness that had been latent in the species, and that environmental conditions and deliberate efforts finally activated. By the time Dinak's consciousness arrived in 3096, this enhanced consciousness was normal, and he found himself in a body and society where people could do things with their minds that would seem like magic to 20th century humans. The society of 3096 operated on principles that Dinak struggled to explain to his contemporary readers. Work as he knew it didn't exist. Automation and advanced technology handled material production, and humans engaged in pursuits that were creative, exploratory, and developmental, rather than subsistence-focused. Education consumed decades of each person's life, not because they were learning job skills, but because they were developing consciousness and capacity, becoming more than their baseline human nature allowed. People lived centuries rather than decades, their bodies maintained by technologies and practices that Dinak couldn't fully comprehend, but that had turned aging into a manageable condition rather than an inevitable decline toward death. Government as Dinak knew it was absent. There was global coordination and decision-making, but it functioned through consensus and shared consciousness rather than through representatives and voting. When humanity needed to make collective decisions, those with developed consciousness could merge awareness temporarily, accessing a form of group mind that allowed understanding of all perspectives simultaneously, making decisions that reflected genuine collective will rather than majority overriding minority. This social technology, this ability to temporarily unify consciousness for decision-making, eliminated many of the conflicts that plagued earlier eras because decisions weren't made by forcing one group's will on another, but by finding solutions that actually integrated everyone's needs and perspectives. Crime and violence were essentially non-existent, not because of punishment or enforcement, but because the consciousness shift had altered human nature at a fundamental level. The drives that created conflict, territorial aggression, resource competition, status anxiety, had been transcended or redirected into channels that didn't harm others. People still had individual desires and goals, but the framework in which they pursued them had changed so dramatically that behaviors Dinak's era considered inevitable. Parts of human nature simply didn't occur anymore. Murder, theft, assault. These belonged to humanity's past, to the consciousness state that people in 3096 had evolved beyond. Dinak described being treated as a medical curiosity during his time in the future. The man whose body he'd woken into had been in a coma, and when Dinak's consciousness from the past animated it, the people of the future realized something extraordinary had occurred. A consciousness from 1,000 years ago, years earlier, had somehow projected forward through time and inhabited one of their contemporaries. They studied him gently, interviewed him about his era, and helped him understand theirs, treating the situation as a rare opportunity to understand humanity's past through someone who'd actually lived it. They were kind, but also somewhat horrified by what Dinak told them about the 20th century, about the wars and poverty and limited consciousness that characterized his time. From their perspective, he was from humanity's dark age, from the period before the transformation, and his memories confirmed how far they'd come from that primitive state. The people of 3096 had access to historical records from all eras, but they understood that recorded history distorts and simplifies, that having someone present who actually experienced the past provided insight that documents couldn't capture. They asked Dinak about emotional states, about how it felt to live in a world of nations and wars, about what consciousness was like before the Great Realization. His answers apparently filled gaps in their understanding of their own history, confirmed some things, and contradicted others, gave them personal testimony about an era they knew intellectually, but couldn't fully comprehend experientially. The question of how Dinak's consciousness traveled through time was never fully answered to his satisfaction. The people of the future theorized that his near-death state during the coma had somehow freed his consciousness from its normal temporal anchoring, allowing it to drift forward along his timeline to a point where a suitable vessel, the comatose man in 3096, was available to receive it. This kind of temporal consciousness displacement was rare, but not unknown to them. They had records of similar cases throughout history, instances where consciousness seemed to slip between times, during states of profound physical distress or transition. They couldn't control or replicate the phenomenon, couldn't send him back deliberately, but they understood it as a natural, if uncommon, occurrence when consciousness became untethered from the body. When DNAC's year in the future ended, when his consciousness returned to his own time and body in 1922, the transition was instantaneous from his perspective. One moment, he was in 3096. The next, he was opening his eyes in a Geneva hospital with doctors and nurses celebrating his emergence from the coma. But he brought back memories of an entire year lived in the future, knowledge of humanity's trajectory, awareness of what was coming and what humanity would have to survive before reaching the enlightened state he'd witnessed. The burden of this knowledge was immense because he had no way to prove it, no way to demonstrate that his experiences were genuine rather than elaborate coma dreams or neurological misfiring. The journals he wrote were his attempt to preserve the knowledge, to leave a record that might be useful to future generations, even if his own contemporaries dismissed him as delusional. He described technologies that wouldn't be invented for centuries, social structures that would seem impossible to people in the 1920s, evolutionary developments in human consciousness that his era had no framework to understand. The text is remarkable for its consistency and detail, for the coherence of the future world it describes, for the careful thought given to how society would function under conditions so different from the 20th century baseline. Skeptics point out that DNAC's future is suspiciously utopian, reflecting the hopes and dreams that someone from the aftermath of World War I might project onto a distant future rather than realistic prediction of how humanity would develop. The absence of specific technological details that could be verified, the focus on social and consciousness developments that are unfalsifiable, the convenient fact that most of what he describes wouldn't occur until long after anyone reading the journals would be alive to check, all suggest that the journals are either conscious fiction or elaborate confabulation produced by a damaged brain during extended unconsciousness, rather than genuine memories from the future. But defenders of DNAC's authenticity note elements of his account that don't fit the standard wishful thinking pattern. He doesn't describe the future as perfect. There are still challenges and conflicts, just operating at higher levels than his era understood. He includes warnings about catastrophes that humanity would face, some of which seemed implausible when he wrote them, but that subsequent history has made more credible. His description of the Great Realization as an evolutionary shift in consciousness, rather than religious salvation or technological transcendence, is unusual for his era, more aligned with concepts from Eastern philosophy and modern consciousness studies than with the prevailing Western religious or materialist frameworks of the 1920s. The question of whether human consciousness can actually travel through time, whether DNAC genuinely experienced what he described, or whether the journals represent elaborate fiction or trauma-induced hallucination, can't be definitively answered unless the future he described actually arrives and can be compared to his account. We're still centuries away from 3096, still experiencing the early stages of the trajectory he outlined, unable to confirm or deny the specific details of the society he claimed to witness. But some elements of his account have proven prescient. He foresaw global governance emerging from necessity, technological developments that would transform society, consciousness research becoming legitimate science rather than dismissed mysticism. Whether these are lucky guesses or genuine memories from a future he actually visited remains contested. The journals remain obscure outside Greece, never achieving widespread attention in the English-speaking world despite their remarkable content. They exist in a liminal space between fiction and prophecy, between dismissed curiosity and potentially significant testimony about humanity's future. For those who believe Dyanak actually experienced what he described, the journals are a roadmap showing where humanity is headed, the trials we'll face, and the transformation awaiting us if we survive. For skeptics, they're interesting science fiction written by a dying man with tuberculosis who spent a year in a coma and emerged with damaged cognition that produced elaborate false memories he genuinely believed were real. What makes the Dyanak Chronicles different from other claims of time travel or prophetic vision is the specific mechanism, not physical time travel or mystical revelation, but consciousness displacement during coma, a phenomenon that, if possible, wouldn't require exotic physics or divine intervention, but rather represents an edge case of consciousness studies, a rare occurrence when awareness becomes untethered from its normal temporal position. If consciousness isn't strictly produced by the brain, but rather filtered or focused through it, then damage to the brain or near-death states might temporarily release consciousness from its usual constraints, allowing it to drift temporally before reconnecting to the body when physical conditions stabilize. This framework makes Dyanak's claim slightly more plausible than traditional time travel stories because it doesn't require paradoxes or machinery or violation of causality. His consciousness observed the future but couldn't change it, couldn't interact in ways that would create grandfather paradoxes or bootstrap paradoxes. He was a passive observer experiencing a year of the future through a borrowed body before returning to his own time with memories that he then spent his remaining years documenting. The future continued on its predetermined path unaffected by his visit, and the past remained unchanged except for one man gaining knowledge he couldn't prove, and that would mostly die with him except for journals that would reach limited circulation decades after his death. The prophecy or prediction aspect is where the journals become testable, though on timescales that make verification difficult. Dyanak describes specific developments in coming centuries when certain transformations would occur. What events would mark turning points in human history? How consciousness evolution would manifest? As time passes and we move through the centuries he documented, his account will either be validated or falsified. If the Great Realization happens around 2400 as he described, if society develops along the trajectories he outlined, if the specific markers he mentioned appear when he said they would, then the probability that he actually experienced what he claimed increases dramatically. If instead human history diverges completely from his account, the journals remain fascinating fiction or delusion, but lose credibility as genuine testimony from the future. Paul Amadeus Dyanak died in 1924, 3 years after his coma, and 2 years after documenting his alleged future memories. He never lived to see any of his predictions come true or be falsified. He never witnessed the Second World War he'd foreseen, never knew whether humanity would survive the 20th century crises he'd described, never learned whether his student would even translate and share the journals, or whether the knowledge would be lost. He died with certainty that he'd experienced something extraordinary, with memories of a year lived 1,000 years in the future, with knowledge of where humanity was headed if it could survive the journey, and with the burden of being unable to prove any of it to a world that would mostly dismiss him as confused or mentally damaged by his year-long coma. The journals remain preserved in Greek translation, available to those curious enough to seek them out, describing a future that's either genuine memories from consciousness displaced through time, or the elaborate imaginings of a dying man's damaged brain creating meaning from chaos during extended unconsciousness. They describe humanity transcending its current limitations, evolving into something greater, surviving catastrophes that would threaten extinction, and ultimately achieving a state of consciousness in society that seems impossibly utopian from our current vantage point. But that Dianak insisted he'd witnessed firsthand, that he'd lived in for a year, that he'd experienced with the same visceral reality that any of us experience our daily lives. Whether he actually did, whether consciousness can travel through time, whether his journals are testimony or fiction, prophecy or delusion, won't be definitively known until the future he described either arrives as he documented it or fails to materialize, until humanity either undergoes the great realization he witnessed or remains forever trapped in consciousness, states that he characterized as primitive and limited compared to what we're capable of becoming. Until 3096 arrives, and we discover whether the world that exists then bears any resemblance to the world that Paul Amadeus Dianak claimed to have visited during his year-long coma in 1921. When his consciousness allegedly left his dying body and woke up in the far future, living in tomorrow for 365 days, before returning to his own time with memories that would die with him. Except for the journals, except for the chronicle of the future, written by a man who claimed he'd been there, who insisted until his death that he'd seen what was coming, who documented humanity's future for anyone willing to consider that maybe, impossibly, a man in a coma really can wake up in the future and return with knowledge of what awaits us. Knowledge that sits in those journals, waiting to be proven true or false by the only test that matters. The passage of time itself carrying humanity forward toward the year 3096, when we'll finally know whether Paul Amadeus Dianak really did wake up in the future, or whether he was just a dying man dreaming of what might be, hoping for transformation, imagining enlightenment, and leaving behind a testament to either genuine temporal consciousness displacement or to humanity's eternal desire to believe that we're destined for something greater than what we currently are, that the future holds transcendence rather than extinction, that if we can just survive the trials ahead, we'll become something remarkable, something he claimed he'd already seen waiting for us 1,000 years from now. The mysterious death of Elisa Lam at the Cecil Hotel. In February 2013, the body of 21-year-old Elisa Lam was discovered in one of the rooftop water tanks of the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, found only after guests complained about discolored water and low water pressure, leading maintenance workers to investigate and discover Elisa's naked body floating in the tank, where it had been decomposing for as long as 19 days, explaining the water complaints but raising immediate questions about how she had gotten into the tank in the first place, why she was in there, how she had accessed the locked roof, how she had climbed into a water tank that required a ladder to reach and was difficult to enter even intentionally, and why her death was there, in that specific tank, in that specific hotel, the Cecil Hotel, a location with such a dark history of violence, death, and serial killer associations that it had become infamous as one of Los Angeles' most sinister addresses, a place where Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, had stayed during his killing spree, where serial killer Jack Unterweger had stayed while murdering prostitutes, where countless suicides and deaths had occurred over decades of operating as Skid Row Flophouse, making the Cecil a location already heavy with death before Elisa Lam arrived, and making her death there feel less like random tragedy and more like the hotel claiming another victim, another life added to its grim tally. But what made Elisa Lam's death transcend typical mysterious death and become internet phenomenon, become the subject of endless speculation and investigation and conspiracy theories, was the elevator surveillance footage released by police showing Elisa's behavior shortly before her disappearance. 4 minutes of extremely strange activity where she enters the elevator, presses multiple buttons, stands in the corner, then steps in and out repeatedly, appears to be hiding from someone or something, gestures strangely with her hands as if communicating or performing some ritual, peers out into the hallway as if checking for someone, and exhibits behavior that seems either profoundly disturbed, influenced by drugs or mental illness, or terrified of something or someone that isn't visible in the footage, creating video that's deeply unsettling to watch, that has been analyzed frame by frame by thousands of internet sleuths, that has generated theories ranging from mental health crisis to paranormal activity to murder cover-up, making Elisa Lam's death a perfect storm of mysterious circumstances, disturbing footage, sinister location, and ambiguous official conclusion that leaves room for doubt, room for alternate theories, room for the suspicion that something more happened than the official explanation of accidental drowning, complicated by bipolar disorder. Acknowledges, leaving Elisa Lam's death as it remains, over a decade later, officially explained but not definitively resolved, concluded by authorities but questioned by observers, understood as tragic accident by some and as unsolved mystery by others, with the elevator footage standing as permanent testament to her final known movements, to her apparent distress or confusion, to behavior that demands explanation but that resists simple interpretation, making her death one of the internet age's most discussed and debated mysterious deaths, one where video evidence exists but only deepens rather than resolves the mystery, where we can watch her but still don't understand what happened to her, where the footage creates as many questions as it answers, leaving Elisa Lam's death suspended between explanation and mystery, between mental health tragedy and something darker, between accident and possible foul play, between what the authorities concluded and what internet investigators continue to question, with the water tank and the elevator footage and the Cecil Hotel's dark history combining into a narrative that resists closure, that generates endless speculation, that transforms a young woman's tragic death into internet phenomenon, into true crime obsession, into mystery that persists despite official conclusions. Because the details don't quite fit. The behavior in the footage doesn't quite make sense. The access to the water tank seems too difficult. The circumstances seem too strange to be mere accident, leaving Elisa Lam's death as permanent question, permanent mystery, permanent tragedy that happened at the Cecil Hotel, in circumstances that remain disturbing, remain unexplained to many observers' satisfaction, remain the subject of documentaries and investigations, and endless internet discussion about what really happened to Elisa Lam. The official investigation concluded that Elisa's death was accidental drowning, with her bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing factor. The coroner found no evidence of physical trauma, no signs of assault, no drugs or alcohol in her system beyond her prescribed psychiatric medications, which she appeared to have stopped taking regularly in the days or weeks before her death, based on toxicology showing lower than therapeutic levels. The conclusion was that Elisa, experiencing a mental health crisis possibly exacerbated by medication noncompliance, accessed the roof of the hotel, climbed into the water tank, perhaps seeking a place to hide, or perhaps in a confused state, not understanding the danger, and then couldn't get out once inside, dying of drowning with her body remaining undiscovered for up to 19 days until the water quality issues prompted investigation. This explanation accounts for the basic facts, but struggles with several logistical problems. The roof access should have been locked and alarmed, requiring either that Elisa found a way to bypass security, that the alarm wasn't functioning, or that she accessed the roof through a route that didn't trigger alarms. The water tank itself was difficult to access, requiring climbing a ladder and then lifting or removing a heavy lid that was on top of the tank. For someone in a mental health crisis to accomplish this alone seems challenging, though not impossible, particularly if adrenaline and altered mental state provided unusual strength or determination. The nakedness is explained as possibly resulting from paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where hypothermic or confused individuals remove clothing. Though Elisa wouldn't have been hypothermic in Los Angeles in February, raising questions about whether this explanation applies. Alternatively, she might have undressed while in the tank for reasons related to her mental state, or her clothing might have come off during her time in the water. Her belongings, including clothing, were found on the roof near the tank, supporting the theory that she undressed before or while entering the tank. The elevator footage is what most troubles observers. Elisa's behavior seems extremely unusual. The repeated entering and exiting, the hiding in the corner, the strange hand gestures, the apparent fear or confusion. Mental health advocates note that this behavior is consistent with severe mental health crisis, possibly psychosis associated with bipolar disorder, particularly if she was unmedicated or experiencing a manic or mixed episode. The gestures might be response to hallucinations. The hiding might reflect paranoid delusions about being followed or threatened. The repeated button pressing might be compulsive behavior, or confusion about how the elevator operates. But other observers see the behavior as suggesting someone was pursuing her, that she was hiding from a real threat rather than from hallucinations, that her gestures might have been trying to signal distress to someone, that her behavior indicates genuine fear rather than psychotic episode. The fact that the elevator door stays open for extended periods during the footage, far longer than it should remain open, has sparked theories about someone holding it from outside the camera frame, though technical explanations suggest the elevator might have been malfunctioning or in service mode. The hotel's security measures and surveillance gaps are significant. The Cecil had cameras in some areas, but not others, creating blind spots where activity wouldn't be recorded. The roof access wasn't continuously monitored by camera, meaning we don't have footage of how Elisa accessed the roof or how she got into the water tank. This absence of complete surveillance creates space for alternate theories. If we could see the roof access and water tank approach, many questions would be answered, but without that footage, we're left with speculation about how a young woman in crisis navigated security measures and accessed a location that should have been restricted. The timing of discovery is disturbing primarily because of the water complaints. Guests were unknowingly using water from a tank containing a decomposing body for up to 2 weeks before the body was found. This has no bearing on how Elisa died, but adds a macabre element that has contributed to the case's notoriety and to the Cecil Hotel's reputation as a cursed location. The internet investigation that emerged around the case represents one of the earliest examples of crowdsourced true crime investigation, with thousands of people analyzing the elevator footage frame by frame, researching Elisa's social media and blog posts, looking for clues about her mental state or her plans, developing theories about everything from serial killer involvement to paranormal activity, to government conspiracy to tuberculosis test coincidence. The last referring to the fact that a TB test is called Lam Elisa, sharing Elisa Lam's name reversed, which led to wild speculation about her death being connected to a tuberculosis outbreak near Skid Row, though this appears to be tragic coincidence rather than meaningful connection. The harm caused by internet investigation in this case is significant. Elisa's family's grief was compounded by online speculation and conspiracy theories. Individuals who appeared in the hotel's surveillance footage, or who were near the hotel, were accused of involvement without evidence, their lives disrupted by false accusations from online investigators convinced they'd identified a suspect. The case demonstrates both the power and the danger of crowdsourced investigation, the power to bring attention to cases and to generate new investigative angles. But the danger of false accusations, conspiracy theory amplification, and the transformation of tragedy into entertainment. The Cecil Hotel's history contributed significantly to suspicion around Elisa's death. The hotel had been site of multiple murders, suicides, and unexplained deaths over its nearly century of operation. Beyond the serial killer connections, Ramirez and Unterweger, staying there during their killing sprees, the hotel had been location where people died with disturbing regularity, where violence and drug activity were common, where the transient population and Skid Row location created an atmosphere of danger and instability. This history primed observers to see Elisa's death as potentially sinister rather than accidental, to suspect that the hotel itself or something about the location was responsible, generating theories about curses, about paranormal activity, about the Cecil claiming victims as if it were a malevolent entity rather than merely building with unfortunate history in challenging neighborhood. The mental health angle is crucial and often insufficiently emphasized in discussion of the case. Elisa had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression, was on medication, and based on her blog posts and social media, appeared to be struggling with her mental health in the period before her death. Her trip to California was solo travel that she'd embarked on despite her parents' concerns, suggesting possible manic episode or elevated mood that gave her confidence to travel alone, despite the risks such travel might pose for someone with unstable mental health. The elevator footage, when viewed through mental health lens rather than through mystery lens, shows someone in crisis experiencing symptoms that could be consistent with psychosis, paranoia, or severe anxiety. Symptoms that people with bipolar disorder can experience during episodes, particularly when unmedicated or undermedicated. The tragedy is that mental health crisis appears to have led to a vulnerable young woman accessing a dangerous location where she died accidentally. And this tragic but explicable death has been transformed by internet culture into mystery that obscures rather than honors her humanity, that treats her death as puzzle to be solved rather than as a person's life that ended in terrible circumstances. The conspiracy theories and endless speculation can feel disrespectful to Elisa and to her family, reducing her to an enigma, to an unsolved case, to an internet mystery, rather than acknowledging her as a real person who struggled with real mental health challenges that contributed to her death. The lesson extends beyond the specific case to questions about how we discuss mysterious deaths, how we balance legitimate questions and investigation with respect for the deceased and their families, how we distinguish between evidence-based skepticism of official conclusions and baseless conspiracy theories, how we prevent amateur investigation from causing harm, while still acknowledging that sometimes official investigations are incomplete or incorrect, and that outside attention can be valuable. The Elisa Lam case occupies uncertain space where the official explanation is probably correct, but where the circumstances are strange enough that continued questioning doesn't seem entirely unreasonable, creating situation where some level of speculation feels justified while also creating harm through baseless accusations and disrespectful theorizing. Whether Elisa Lam's death was tragic accident resulting from mental health crisis, whether it was something more sinister that hasn't been adequately investigated, or whether the truth lies somewhere between these positions, accepting the accidental death conclusion while also acknowledging that some questions remain about how exactly she accessed the tank and whether any other parties were involved in ways that weren't determined. The case stands as a reminder that mysterious circumstances don't necessarily indicate mystery that requires exotic explanation, that sometimes the most likely explanation is the correct one even when details seem strange, that mental health crises can lead to behaviors and outcomes that seem inexplicable to observers who don't understand the internal experience of severe psychological distress, and that the internet age has transformed how we engage with true crime and mysterious deaths in ways that can be both illuminating and harmful, both bringing attention to cases that might otherwise be overlooked and generating false theories that cause real damage to real people, leaving Elisa Lam's death as it remains. Officially explained as accidental drowning complicated by mental illness, questioned by many who find that explanation insufficient, memorialized through endless internet discussion that ranges from thoughtful analysis to baseless conspiracy theory, and ultimately understood differently by different observers, depending on whether they trust official conclusions or whether they see the strange circumstances as evidence of something more, whether they view the elevator footage as documenting mental health crisis or as showing someone genuinely being pursued or threatened, whether they accept that sometimes tragic accidents happen in ways that seem improbable, or whether they believe the improbability itself suggests that more investigation is warranted, leaving Elisa Lam's death as permanent fixture of internet true crime discussion, as case that won't be forgotten, because the footage exists, because the circumstances were strange, because the Cecil Hotel's dark history makes any death there seem potentially sinister, and because a young woman died in circumstances that feel like they should have been preventable, that trigger our desire to find explanation beyond accident, beyond mental health crisis, beyond the tragic reality that sometimes people die in ways that seem inexplicable, but that are ultimately the result of illness and circumstance rather than of mystery or malevolence, leaving Elisa Lam's memory caught between being honored as victim of tragic accident and being treated as subject of endless speculation, between being acknowledged as person who struggled with mental health and being reduced to internet mystery, between the explanation that authorities provided and the doubts that observers maintain. Suspended as she was in that water tank, suspended between life and death, suspended between known and unknown, suspended in the permanent, uncertain space where her case remains, explained but questioned, concluded but unresolved, tragic but mysterious. A death at the Cecil Hotel that was either exactly what it appears to be or something else entirely, depending on who's analyzing it, who's discussing it, who's trying to understand what happened to Elisa Lam in February 2013, when she disappeared into the Cecil Hotel's dark history, when she climbed into a water tank for reasons we can only infer, when she died in circumstances that official investigation concluded were accidental. But that continued to trouble observers who watch that elevator footage and see behavior that demands explanation. That suggests something more happened than simple mental health crisis, or who accept the mental health explanation, but still feel profound sadness that a young woman experiencing crisis ended up alone on a roof, alone in a water tank, alone in her final moments in ways that feel like failure. Failure of mental health systems, failure of hotel security, failure of circumstances to align in ways that might have saved her, leaving her death as permanent tragedy, permanent mystery, permanent case that internet age has made impossible to forget, that surveillance footage has made impossible to ignore, that strange circumstances have made impossible to explain to everyone's satisfaction, leaving Elisa Lam's death as it will likely always remain. A tragedy that official investigation concluded was accidental, but that observers continue to question, continue to analyze, continue to discuss, making her one of the most discussed deaths of the internet era. One where we have footage of her final known moments, but where that footage only deepens the mystery, only increases the questions, only makes us wonder what was happening in those 4 minutes in the elevator, what she was afraid of, what she was trying to communicate, what happened to her in the hours after that footage, when she somehow accessed the roof and climbed into a water tank where she would die, and where her body would remain for weeks before being discovered. leaving Elisa Lam's death as permanent question about what happened at the Cecil Hotel, about what took a young woman's life in circumstances that remain disturbing, remain unexplained to many, remain the subject of endless speculation that has transformed her death into mystery that persists, that endures, that makes the Cecil Hotel even more infamous than it was before, makes Elisa Lam's name synonymous with internet age mysterious death, makes her case the example of how surveillance footage can document but not explain, can show us what happened but not why, can create evidence that generates more questions than answers, leaving us with the footage, with the water tank, with the questions, with the tragedy of a young woman who died at 21. In circumstances that official investigation called accidental, but that continue to haunt observers who watch that elevator footage and feel that something more happened, something we're missing, something that the official conclusion doesn't capture, leaving Elisa Lam's death as permanent mystery, permanent tragedy, permanent case that remains unsettled despite official conclusions, that remains disturbing despite explanations, that remains the subject of speculation and discussion and endless analysis by people who watch that footage and ask what happened to Elisa Lam, why she behaved the way she did, how she ended up in that water tank, and whether the official explanation is sufficient or whether something more needs to be investigated, needs to be understood, needs to be explained before we can truly say we know what happened to Elisa Lam at the Cecil Hotel in February 2013, when she disappeared and died in circumstances that remain, after all these years, profoundly disturbing, profoundly mysterious, and profoundly tragic. The Montauk Chair: Reading and Controlling Human Thoughts. At the eastern end of Long Island, New York, sits an abandoned Air Force station called Camp Hero. The base was officially decommissioned in 1981, its radar systems shut down, its personnel reassigned, its purpose apparently fulfilled. But according to witnesses who claim to have worked there, to have been held there, or to have participated in experiments conducted there, Camp Hero never truly closed. Instead, it became the site of one of the most ambitious and disturbing secret research programs ever attempted. A project focused on the manipulation of time, space, consciousness, and human thought itself. At the center of these alleged experiments was a device known as the Montauk Chair, a piece of technology that could supposedly read minds, amplify psychic abilities, and ultimately control what people think, feel, remember, and perceive as reality. The Montauk Project, as the overall program came to be known, allegedly began as an extension of earlier research conducted during World War II and the immediate post-war period. The story connects to the Philadelphia Experiment, another controversial, alleged project involving the USS Eldridge and experiments with electromagnetic fields that supposedly caused the ship to become invisible, teleport, and create catastrophic effects on the crew. Whether or not the Philadelphia Experiment occurred as described, the theory holds that the research continued, that scientists became obsessed with understanding and controlling electromagnetic phenomena, particularly as they related to human consciousness and perception. By the 1970s, according to those who have come forward with testimony, the research had moved to Camp Hero and expanded dramatically in scope. The base's massive AN/FPS 35 radar system, a huge dish antenna visible for miles, wasn't just for detecting aircraft. The theory suggests it was modified to broadcast specific electromagnetic frequencies that could interact with human brainwaves, could influence thoughts and emotions across wide areas, could even open doorways through time and space. But broadcasting wasn't enough. The researchers wanted precision, control, the ability to target specific minds and create specific effects. That's where the Montauk Chair came in. The chair is described by alleged witnesses as a physical seat wired with sensors and surrounded by equipment that could detect and amplify the electromagnetic signature of human thoughts. A person with psychic abilities would sit in the chair, and their thoughts would be read by the system, translated into electromagnetic patterns, amplified by the massive radar array, and then projected outward as a transmittable signal. The chair didn't just read thoughts, it made them powerful enough to affect physical reality, to influence other minds, to materialize objects or entities, to create distortions in time and space. The human mind became both the input device and the power source for technology that could reshape reality itself. According to Preston Nichols, one of the primary witnesses to come forward about Montauk, he worked as an electrical engineer at the facility and was directly involved in developing and refining the chair technology. Nichols claims that operators with natural psychic sensitivity were recruited or created through training and enhancement programs. These individuals would sit in the chair and focus their thoughts while technicians monitored and recorded the electromagnetic patterns generated. Over time, the system learned to recognize specific thought patterns, the signature of aggression, of fear, of desire, of specific memories or intentions. Once these patterns were cataloged, they could theoretically be broadcast to affect target populations. The applications described are both fascinating and horrifying. Imagine being able to project specific emotional states across a city or military base. You could induce panic in enemy soldiers, create artificial calm in a rioting population, implant suggestions that would seem to come from the target's own mind. The chair could allegedly be used to read thoughts at a distance, pulling information directly from a person's consciousness without them knowing they were being scanned. It could implant false memories, making people believe they had experienced events that never occurred, or erase real memories, creating gaps and confusion in their life narrative. The ultimate surveillance and control technology, operating on the most intimate level possible, inside human consciousness itself. Some accounts describe experiments where operators in the chair were instructed to manifest physical objects through focused thought. The amplified mental energy would supposedly cause items to materialize in the laboratory, pulled from somewhere, created from something, through a process that witnesses struggled to explain and that violated everything known about physics and matter. Other experiments allegedly involved projecting consciousness through time, with operators describing events from the past or future while sitting in the chair. Their awareness displaced from the present moment, experiencing other times as vividly as their current reality. The most disturbing claims involve the use of the chair on unwilling subjects, particularly children and adolescents. Multiple witnesses have described being brought to Montauk as young people, being placed in the chair, and being subjected to procedures that read their thoughts, implanted programming, enhanced their psychic abilities through traumatic means, or used them as biological components in experiments they couldn't understand. These accounts often involve significant gaps in memory, missing time, and fragmented recollections that only surfaced years or decades later, sometimes under hypnosis, or triggered by specific events that broke through amnesia blocks. The theory suggests that the Montauk researchers discovered that young minds, particularly those who had been traumatized or who had natural psychic sensitivity, could be molded into more effective operators for the chair. Trauma fragments consciousness, creating dissociated states that can each be programmed separately, turned into discrete functional units that can be activated by specific triggers. A child subjected to this process might grow up with no conscious memory of Montauk, living a normal life until a predetermined signal activates programming buried in their psyche, turning them into an unwitting agent or asset for whoever controls the trigger. The technology of the chair supposedly relied on understanding that thoughts are not purely electrochemical events confined to the brain, but have an electromagnetic component that extends beyond the skull, creating fields that can be detected and manipulated. Every thought generates a specific pattern, a unique signature that can be recorded, analyzed, and replicated. If you can capture that signature, amplify it, and broadcast it, you can essentially transmit thoughts like radio signals. The receiving brain, tuned to the same frequency, would experience the transmitted thought as if it originated internally, with no awareness that it came from an external source. Critics of the Montauk claims point to a lack of physical evidence, the absence of documentation, the fact that most testimony comes from recovered memories or secondhand accounts. They note that Camp Hero was a real military installation, but that its actual history involves conventional radar operations and coastal defense, nothing exotic or experimental. The radar system was large and powerful, but designed for aircraft detection, not consciousness manipulation. Photographs and videos of the abandoned facility show decaying buildings and equipment, but nothing that obviously relates to the described chair or the alleged experiments. However, believers counter that the entire point of a clandestine program is to leave no evidence, to operate in ways that can be plausibly denied, to ensure that even if witnesses come forward, their claims can't be verified through documentation or physical proof. The nature of mind control and consciousness manipulation means victims wouldn't reliably remember what happened to them. Those involved in conducting the experiments would be bound by security clearances and compartmentalization. Equipment could be removed, facilities cleaned, records destroyed. The lack of conventional evidence doesn't disprove the claims. It's exactly what you'd expect if the program operated the way witnesses describe. The Montauk chair theory connects to broader frameworks about government mind control research that we know occurred. MKUltra is declassified fact, not theory. The CIA absolutely did conduct experiments on unwitting subjects, did explore hypnosis and drugs and psychological torture as means of control, did create programs that damaged or destroyed people's minds in pursuit of techniques that could create programmable assets. If they were willing to dose people with LSD without consent, to attempt to erase and rebuild personalities, to explore every conceivable avenue of consciousness manipulation, is it really unthinkable that they would also explore electromagnetic and psychotronic means of achieving the same goals? The chair represents the culmination of this research, the point where all the different avenues, electromagnetic fields, psychic phenomena, trauma-based programming, technological amplification, come together into an integrated system. If such technology exists, if it was developed and refined, then its implications are staggering. Every thought you have, every memory you possess, every perception of reality you experience could potentially be influenced or entirely constructed by external forces. You would have no way of knowing. The thoughts would feel like yours. The memories would seem real. The reality you perceived would be the only reality you could access. Some researchers have explored whether the technology described in Montauk testimony is even theoretically possible. Electromagnetic fields do interact with the brain. This is established science. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is a real medical technology that uses magnetic fields to alter brain activity, to treat depression, to stimulate or suppress specific regions. If relatively weak, focused magnetic fields can affect mood and cognition, what could massive, amplified, precisely targeted electromagnetic broadcasts accomplish? The difference between established medical technology and alleged Montauk capabilities might be one of degree rather than kind, a question of power and precision rather than fundamental possibility. There are also accounts of the Montauk experiments producing unintended consequences, situations where operators in the chair manifested entities or opened doorways that the researchers couldn't control. Stories circulate of creatures appearing in the facility, of time portals opening spontaneously, of past and future bleeding into the present in ways that endangered the entire project. These accounts have an almost mythological quality, but they align with the idea that the researchers were dealing with forces and principles they didn't fully understand, pushing boundaries that perhaps shouldn't be pushed, accessing levels of reality that human consciousness isn't meant to manipulate. The project allegedly ended in 1983, shut down after experiments went too far, produced results too dangerous to continue. But whistleblowers claim the research didn't stop. It moved, evolved, became more sophisticated and more hidden. The chair technology, if it worked, would be too valuable to abandon. Instead, it would be refined, miniaturized perhaps, deployed in ways that don't require a massive radar installation and a psychic sitting in a wired chair. Modern technology offers possibilities that didn't exist in the 1970s and 80s. If thoughts can be read and transmitted electromagnetically, could your smartphone do it? Could cell towers? Could the wireless networks that surround us constantly be serving purposes beyond communication and data transfer? The Montauk chair exists in a space between documented history and speculative theory. Camp Hero is real. Mind control research happened. Electromagnetic fields affect consciousness. Psychic phenomena, while controversial, have been studied by serious researchers and intelligence agencies. The chair brings these elements together into a specific claim about specific technology allegedly developed at a specific place. Whether it existed exactly as described, whether some version of it exists now in more advanced form, or whether it represents a symbolic crystallization of fears about government overreach and technological control over human consciousness. The concept resonates because it addresses something fundamentally disturbing about the modern world. We live surrounded by electromagnetic fields, immersed in wireless signals, constantly connected to devices and networks whose full capabilities we don't understand. Our thoughts feel private, but are they? Could they be monitored, influenced, guided without our awareness? The Montauk chair makes these abstract concerns concrete, gives them a specific form and history, transforms vague unease into detailed allegations about what was done, how it was done, and what it means for anyone who wants to believe their mind is their own. And somewhere in the archives of whatever agencies conducted consciousness research, or in facilities we don't know exist, or in the memories of people who still can't fully recall what was done to them, the truth about the chair and what it could do might rest, classified and buried, waiting for the moment when someone finally produces evidence that can't be denied or explained away. The Overtown Bridge, where dogs jump to their deaths. There's a Victorian stone bridge in Scotland, built in 1895, that spans a rocky gorge near the village of Milton in West Dunbartonshire. It's a beautiful structure, the kind that appears on postcards and tourist guides. Ornate stonework arching gracefully above a 50-foot drop to the Overtoun Burn below. People walk across it regularly, enjoying the views of the surrounding countryside and the historic Overtoun house that stands nearby. But dogs, specifically dogs on leashes being walked by their owners, will suddenly, without warning or apparent provocation, leap over the parapet wall to the rocks below. They don't stumble or slip. They don't act distressed or panicked before jumping. They simply reach a certain point on the bridge, usually on the same side and in the same general area, and then they leap deliberately over the edge as if something below is calling them, as if the 50-foot drop doesn't exist in their perception, as if whatever they're compelled toward is worth jumping for despite the physics of the fall and the rocks waiting at the bottom. Since the 1950s, at least 600 dogs have jumped, and approximately 50 have died from the fall. Numbers that far exceed what coincidence or accident should produce, creating a pattern so consistent that locals call Overtoun Bridge the Dog Suicide Bridge, though the word suicide implies intent that we can't confirm in animals. leaving the question of why they jump as mysterious as the fact that they do, creating a phenomenon that has attracted animal behavior experts, paranormal investigators, and scientists trying to understand what specific property of this specific bridge causes this specific behavior in dogs, and only at this one location, suggesting that something about the bridge or the gorge it spans affects canine perception or instinct in ways that override their survival drive and compel them to leap to probable death. The victims are almost exclusively long-nosed breeds: collies, Labradors, retrievers. Dogs with enhanced olfactory capabilities, whose sense of smell dominates their sensory experience of the world. This breed specificity is one of the few consistent elements in an otherwise baffling pattern. The jumps occur most frequently on clear, sunny days, rarely in rain or poor weather. The dogs jump from the same side of the bridge, the right side, when walking from the village toward Overtoun House, and usually from the same stretch of parapet between the last two turrets. These consistencies suggest environmental factors, rather than random psychological breakdown or individual dog pathology. Something about this location, these conditions, this specific stretch of stonework, triggers behavior that appears suicidal, but that might more accurately be described as compulsion toward something the dog perceives below that overrides every instinct to avoid the obviously dangerous leap. Witnesses describe the behavior as sudden and absolute. Dogs that were walking calmly, showing no signs of distress or unusual interest, will abruptly lunge toward the parapet, pulling against their leashes with strength that sometimes tears the lead from the owner's hands. In cases where owners manage to hold them back, the dogs struggle violently, fixated on getting over the wall, exhibiting single-minded determination that's deeply uncharacteristic of normal canine behavior. Dogs are generally cautious about heights and drops. They don't typically leap from positions where they can't see a safe landing. Yet at Overtoun Bridge, this caution evaporates, replaced by overwhelming compulsion to jump that's so powerful it overrides millions of years of evolved survival instinct. The few dogs that have survived the fall and been brought back onto the bridge have attempted to jump again immediately, suggesting that whatever they perceive below isn't eliminated by experiencing the fall, by the pain and trauma that should create strong negative associations with the location. Instead, the compulsion persists, indicating that it's not curiosity about the gorge that can be satisfied by investigation, but rather an ongoing perception or stimulus that continues to affect the dog's behavior, regardless of previous experience. The scientific explanation that has gained most traction involves scent. The gorge below the bridge is home to a population of minks and possibly other small mammals whose scent glands produce pungent territorial markings. The theory holds that dogs with strong scenting ability detect these smells as they walk across the bridge, and the combination of the scent's intensity, the height providing optimal scent dispersal on updrafts from the gorge, and the dog's predatory instincts creates an overwhelming urge to pursue the perceived prey. The dogs aren't committing suicide. They're reacting to what they interpret as huntable prey directly below them, not recognizing or not processing the danger of the 50-foot fall because their olfactory drive has completely dominated their decision-making. This explanation accounts for the breed specificity. Long-nosed breeds with enhanced scenting ability would be more susceptible to olfactory compulsion than short-nosed breeds. It explains why clear days see more incidents. Wind and weather conditions affect scent dispersal, and optimal conditions might create particularly strong scent corridors, rising from the gorge. It explains the location specificity. The right side of the bridge might be where updrafts carry scent most strongly, where the particular geometry of the gorge and the bridge's orientation creates a scent column that affects passing dogs. But this explanation struggles with certain elements. Dogs encounter prey scent constantly, including scents from animals, in positions they can't reach or in directions that would be dangerous to pursue. Urban dogs smell squirrels in trees, rats in walls, prey animals across busy roads, and while they might show interest or pull toward the scent, they don't typically attempt suicidal leaps to reach it. The fact that overtuned bridge dogs override not just leash restraint, but also the visual evidence of a deadly drop suggests something more profound than normal prey drive response to scent. And the absolute nature of the compulsion, the way it completely overrides everything else in the dog's awareness, seems excessive even for scent-driven hunting breeds. The paranormal explanations focus on the bridge and the surrounding area's history and reputation. Overtown House, which the bridge leads to, has its own dark history involving a tragic death in 1994, when a man killed his infant son, claiming the child was possessed by the devil, before attempting to kill himself by jumping from the house. The combination of this recent tragedy and older local legends about the area being haunted or cursed creates a framework where the bridge might be seen as a location where dimensional boundaries thin, where entities might influence or lure animals, where energy or forces that affect sensitive beings like dogs create the compulsion to jump. In this interpretation, dogs are responding not to physical scent, but to spiritual or dimensional stimuli that humans can't perceive, but that animals detect through senses we don't fully understand. The compulsion would be analogous to how dogs sometimes react to nothing, barking at empty corners, refusing to enter certain rooms, behaving as if they perceive presences that humans don't register. At Overtown Bridge, whatever dogs perceive would be powerful enough not just to disturb them, but to compel them to jump, to override survival instinct in pursuit of or escape from something that exists in layers of reality we can't access. The Celtic history of the region includes legends about thin places where the barrier between the mortal world and the other world is permeable. Overtoun, the area's name, comes from Gaelic and relates to streams and water, elements traditionally associated with transitions and thresholds in Celtic mythology. If the gorge and bridge occupy a thin place, dogs might perceive entities or realms that appear to be accessible by jumping, might see something below that looks like safe ground or open space because it exists dimensionally adjacent to the physical gorge, creating a visual/perceptual mismatch where the dog's sensory input shows them something jumpable while physics shows them a lethal drop. Acoustic explanations have been proposed involving infrasound or ultrasound that humans can't hear, but that dogs detect. If the bridge's structure, the wind moving through the gorge, and the water below combine to create specific frequencies that affect canine hearing, this might produce distress or disorientation that manifest as the jumping behavior. But this theory struggles with why distress would manifest as jumping in a specific direction rather than as general panic or retreat, and why dogs would consistently jump toward rather than away from a distressing sound source. Magnetic field anomalies are occasionally suggested, proposing that unusual magnetic characteristics in the gorge's geology might affect dog navigation or sensory processing. Dogs use magnetic field sensing for navigation, and disruption to this sense might create disorientation that manifests as the jump behavior. However, magnetic sensitivity in dogs is subtle and generally used for orientation over distances, rather than for immediate navigation, making it unlikely that field anomalies would create such dramatic behavioral changes. The veterinary and animal behavior experts who've studied Overtoun bridge jumpers haven't identified any common pathology or condition among the dogs beyond the breed correlation. They weren't ill, weren't showing signs of neurological problems, weren't on medications or exhibiting other behavioral issues. They were, by all accounts, normal healthy dogs, until the moment they reached that specific stretch of bridge and suddenly weren't. Suddenly became animals willing to jump 50 feet to rocks because something overrode every instinct and training and bond with their owners, compelled them toward the edge with force that couldn't be reasoned with or restrained against. The question of awareness, whether the dogs understand they're jumping to probable death, is philosophically murky. We can't know what a dog comprehends about height and falling and mortality. It's possible they perceive the drop, but simply don't process it as dangerous because whatever they're pursuing or fleeing dominates their decision-making completely. It's possible they don't perceive the drop accurately, that the visual processing or the scent or the whatever they're experiencing creates a distorted perception where they believe they're jumping to accessible ground. Or it's possible they perceive everything accurately, but the compulsion is so overwhelming that they jump despite knowing the danger. Not because they want to die, but because whatever is compelling them is more powerful than their fear of death. The owners are left traumatized, watching their beloved pets suddenly transform from companionable animals into creatures possessed by incomprehensible compulsion, pulling free or leaping despite restraint, falling to the rocks while the owner stands helpless on the bridge, unable to prevent or understand what just happened. Many have described feeling that their dog was called by something, that the jump wasn't impulsive, but rather a response to something the dog perceived that the owner couldn't sense. The grief is compounded by the mystery. If your dog had been hit by a car or died of illness, there's tragedy but comprehension. When your dog deliberately jumps off a bridge for no discernible reason, the grief includes profound confusion about who or what your dog was in that moment, what they perceived, why they abandoned safety and bond with you to leap into empty air. Warning signs have been posted. Local authorities and animal welfare groups have publicized the phenomenon, advising dog walkers to keep their pets on short leashes, to use the left side of the bridge, to potentially avoid the bridge entirely if possible. These warnings have reduced but not eliminated the incidents, suggesting that awareness and caution can help but can't completely prevent the behavior when dogs encounter whatever stimulus triggers it. The bridge itself can't be easily modified. It's a listed historic structure, protected as an example of Victorian architecture, and the parapet height is set by the original design. Raising the walls would require permissions that balance historical preservation against animal safety, a bureaucratic process that moves slowly, even as dogs continue to jump. Some have suggested closing the bridge to pedestrians with dogs, but it's a public right-of-way and completely prohibiting. A category of user is legally and practically complicated. The phenomenon has attracted enough attention that Overtown Bridge appears in lists of the world's most mysterious locations, profiled in documentaries and paranormal investigations, studied by animal behaviorists, and addressed in scientific papers attempting to explain the pattern. Yet it persists. Dogs still jump, still die, still provide evidence that something about this location affects canine behavior in ways we don't fully understand despite decades of observation and multiple investigative approaches. Whether the explanation is ultimately mundane, a peculiarity of scent dispersal that creates overwhelming olfactory stimulus that dogs can't resist pursuing, or whether it involves elements we don't fully grasp about animal perception, about how dogs sense aspects of reality that humans miss, about dimensional thin places or acoustic or magnetic effects that science hasn't properly characterized. Overtown Bridge remains as testament to the fact that sometimes locations exist where normal behavior breaks down, where animals respond to stimuli we can't detect or understand, where the patterns are consistent enough that we know something is occurring, but mysterious enough that we can't definitively explain what or why. And every time a dog approaches that stretch of Victorian stonework, every time a long-nosed breed walks the right side of Overtown Bridge on a clear day, there's a chance they'll suddenly detect something, a scent, a sound, a presence, a dimensional bleeding, whatever it actually is. And they'll pull toward the parapet with a force that surprises their owner, with determination that seems impossible for a domesticated animal, with fixation that overrides every other input and every bit of training. And they'll leap over the edge toward the rocks 50 feet below, toward whatever they perceive that we cannot, toward death, or toward something they believe is worth dying to reach, leaving their owners traumatized and confused on the bridge above, leaving investigators and scientists with another data point in a pattern they still can't explain, leaving Overtown Bridge standing as it has stood for over a century, beautiful and historic and inexplicably deadly to dogs who walk across it, who encounter whatever is there that calls to them, that compels them to jump, that creates behavior so consistent across hundreds of animals over decades that we know it's real, even though we still don't know why, still don't know what dogs perceive that we miss, still don't know whether the answer is in biology or physics or dimensions we don't normally access. Still don't know why this bridge, why these conditions, why only dogs, why only certain breeds, why the compulsion is so absolute that survival instinct becomes irrelevant, why dogs jump to their deaths at Overtown Bridge while humans walk across without incident, blind to whatever the dogs sense, unable to perceive whatever calls them from the gorge below, unable to stop them once they've decided to jump, to answer that call, to leap toward whatever waits in the rocks and water and air of that Scottish gorge, where something, somehow, for reasons we still cannot definitively explain, makes dogs willing to die.